Good morning, students. Today is Friday, 23 April 2021. This is our second lecture for this week. After today, we have only 3 lectures remaining. All 3 of them will be on the final chapter that we're covering, Chapter 10. I will be posting Chapter 10 sometime today, later today, so you can get a start on reading it. Please read the first of 3 sections before the next videotaped lecture. Chapter 10 contains 3 different sections. Read the first one for the first lecture next week. So here's what we have left this semester. After today, we have 2 lectures next week, both on Chapter 10. We have 1 lecture the following week, which will wrap things up on Chapter 10. And then on the 11th of May, we have our 3rd examination. And that's only 18 days from now. So it's coming up quickly. Make sure you've watched all your videos well in advance, made notes. You don't want to put it off until the very end, because things could come up. You'll find that you're not ready for the exam. And there will be no makeup exams. Everybody must take it on that same day. The end of the semester is a very busy time for professors as well as students. We have deadlines for getting grades posted. And so the exam will be on the 11th of May. As usual, you will have a 12-hour window from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. And you need to go in sometime during that 12-hour window and take 75 minutes to complete the exam. Okay, again, I'll be posting Chapter 10 sometime later today. All right, before we get started on our final day on Kant, this may surprise you, but Kant was a professor at the University of Königsberg for many decades. He spent his whole career there. And he was already quite famous early in his career worldwide. And his students, when they took his course, knew that they were privileged to be able to hear the great master speak on whatever topic he was addressing, including ethics. And a couple of his students took copious notes on his lectures, which have now been published. And some of them commented later in their lives on what it was like to be a student of Kant, to be in his classroom. And I have a quotation from one of his students. His name is Jachmann, Jachmann. And here's what he said. Now, there are two different quotations by Jachmann. One of them is short, one of them is a little bit longer. Now listen to this. Jachmann wrote, he, referring to Kant, was almost worshipped by his students, who took every opportunity of letting him know it. People used to wait attentively to see him as he crossed the courtyard of the Albertinium on his way to the great lecture hall for a meeting of the Senate or an academic ceremony. Unquote. So Jachmann is pointing out that Kant was famous, so famous that students just wanted to get a glimpse of him as he walked about on campus. And here's a longer quotation from that same student, Jachmann. He said, and these are referring to Kant's lectures on ethics specifically. In these lectures, he said he, but he was referring to Kant. In these lectures, he ceased to be merely a speculative philosopher and became at the same time a spirited orator, sweeping the heart and emotions along with him, as well as satisfying the intelligence. Indeed, it was a heavenly delight to hear his sublimely pure ethical doctrine delivered with such powerful philosophic eloquence from the lips of its very creator. How often he moved us to tears. How often he stirred our hearts to their depths. How often he lifted up our minds and emotions from the shackles of self-seeking egoism to the exalted self-awareness of pure free will, to absolute obedience to the laws of reason, and to the exalted sense of our duty to others. Unquote. Now, this is a student of Kant, and he's telling the world, he's informing the world of what it was like to be a student of Kant. And he says that it was an emotional experience. Not only was it intellectually edifying in that they learned a great deal about ethics, but it was emotional. His rhetoric swept them along. In fact, Yachman says more than once he moved them to tears. Now, I admit, after teaching for more than 3 decades, I have never moved my students, including my ethics students, to tears. But I guess there's still time to do that, right? Maybe you right now watching this lecture or later today, you will be moved to tears by my lecture. I'm being facetious. Of course, students today aren't typically moved emotionally by the lectures of their professors. So why was Yachman moved to tears? Why was this an emotional experience? Well, you have to go back in time and put yourself in his shoes. This was a time of great class stratification. There was a royal family in East Prussia. There was a king. And of course, when you have a monarchy like that, you have a whole range of courtiers and administrators and so on, barons, and all the way down to the lowly serf. And Kant's ethical doctrine held that every person, whatever his or her social status or social class may be, every person has an exalted moral status. Every person has a dignity. Every person must be treated with respect. Every person is capable of understanding and abiding by the moral law. And Kant also rejected egoism. Kant rejected the view that we may, morally speaking, do whatever maximizes our own happiness or pleasure. Kant insisted that we have duties to others, including to strangers. We have duties to respect everyone, and we have positive duties to promote their own interests and their ends. So when you put it all together, at this time and place, Kant's teachings in ethics were quite radical. He was teaching revolutionary doctrines to his students, and it made his students feel important. They may have come to the university thinking that they occupied a low status, or that they were unworthy, that they lacked a certain amount of dignity. And here was Kant saying, no, you are a dignified being. You have reason like everyone else. You're capable of using it. You're capable of using your reason to understand the moral law and to follow it. And you have a chance to be holy, or at least approach holiness. You should try to make it so that your actions are not only in conformity with the moral law, but that they are motivated by the moral law. And Kant held that it's not enough to do the right thing. In other words, it's not enough just to do your duty. For Kant, you must do your duty from a certain motive, and that motive is duty itself. So Kant's view is that you must do your duty for the sake of duty, not because it will make you happy or friends, or that it will make you famous or wealthy or anything else. You should do your duty, you must do your duty solely for the sake of duty. So for Kant, there are 2 basic concepts: right action and morally worthy action. Right action means doing your duty in accordance with the moral law. That makes your action right. In order for your action to go beyond that and be morally worthy, the act must be motivated by duty alone. Any other motive that enters in corrupts the worthiness of the act and reduces the worthiness of the act. Now, there will be a question, or maybe 2, on the exam about this, so I hope you're paying attention. Luckily, you can rewind it and listen to it again. So what I'm saying is that all morally worthy acts are morally right. In order for an act to be morally worthy, it has to be right at a minimum. It has to be in accordance with duty. But not all acts that are in accordance with duty are morally worthy. What if I happen to comply with the categorical imperative because I'm concerned with my own happiness? For Kant, that's not a worthy motive. So he would say in a case like that, while I am doing the right thing, objectively speaking, my mind is not in the right place. I'm doing the right thing for the wrong reason, he would say. The only right reason, the only worthy reason, the only worthy motive is duty. And to the extent that we can bring our actions in conformity to the categorical imperative and use that as the sole motive of our actions, we become holy. We become godlike. God presumably has to make no effort whatsoever to do the right thing. God doesn't have to fight off contrary inclinations or impulses. God never has to say, for example, gee, I would like to do the following, but that would be to violate my duty, so I will not do it. Humans agonize like that all the time. Humans always have to resist temptations to violate their duty. But God doesn't have any temptations. God spontaneously and automatically does the right thing, the worthy thing. Human beings, therefore, are not like God. We are not gods, but we can approach godliness incrementally over the course of our lives by training ourselves to do our duty for the sake of duty. Okay, so we can become godlike or approach godliness, if you will. That would be the ideal. Okay, so those are a couple of quotations by a student of Kant's, and I'm trying to explain to you why his lectures on ethics were so moving and emotional to them, so inspirational. I want to go back to the handout that I've posted for you. Actually, I posted two separate handouts. Remember, the first one is from Kant's book in 1785 entitled Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, and I've excerpted only 4 pages of that book for you, and they're numbered 1 through 4. If you go to the 5th page of the handout, notice I've stapled my 2 handouts together to make one handout. If you look at the 5th page of the combined handout, you'll see the title, The Metaphysics of Morals. That's the second handout that I posted. I've stapled it to the first handout for my purposes. And it starts the numbering all over again at 1. And that handout goes from page 1 to page 18. So the total handout, the total 2 handouts, if you make it into one handout, consists of 22 pages, 4 plus 18. I probably should have numbered it straight through from 1 to 22, but instead it's 1 through 4, and then start over 1 through 18. So I'm going to comment briefly now on the first handout from the groundwork, which consists of 4 pages. I'm just going to pick out a couple of little quotations, and for the rest of today's lecture, I'm going to focus on the second handout from the Metaphysics of Morals. Okay, so look at page 1 of the first handout. You see some yellowed parts. Those are the parts I mean to read to you. This is Kant speaking. And in part, this is a review of things we've already talked about. Kant says, now I say that the human being, and in general every rational being, exists as end in itself, not merely as means to the discretionary use of this or that will, but in all its actions, those directed toward itself, as well as those directed toward other rational beings, it must always at the same time be considered as an end. So there's a lot going on there. First of all, Kant is indicating that there are duties to not only ourselves, but to other people. He's also saying that he's making a distinction between treating a being as an end and treating a being as a means only. And what he's saying is that, well, when we interact with other persons or with ourselves, we must always treat the person in question as an end and never merely as a means. Remember the importance of that word merely. We inevitably treat other persons as means to our ends. We couldn't survive if we didn't. When you go to the store to buy something, each of you, the buyer and the seller, is treating the other as a means to his or her own ends. And that's okay, as long as, in addition to that, each of you is treating the other as an end. And that's what respect is all about. You respect others when you treat them as ends, even if you're also treating them as means. Now turn the page. I'm going to look, you see some more yellowed parts on my handout. I have a couple of little quotations from Kant. The first one I've mentioned already, I've read to you already. Kant says in about the middle of the page, rational nature exists as end in itself. So for Kant, at least one of the things in the world that is intrinsically good or intrinsically valuable is what he calls rational nature. Another name for that is autonomy. Autonomy means self-governing. So self-governing beings like you and me, we are ends in ourselves. We occupy a special status of all the things in the world. Everything in the world is either a rational being or it's not. If it's a rational being, it's an end in itself. It has intrinsic value, intrinsic worth. If it's not a rational being, then it's a mere means to our ends. And Kant lumped animals into that second category. Animals are things, according to Kant. They're not persons. There's not one animal or animal species that, for Kant, is an end in itself. They are things. They are property. They are to be used for our purposes, and that's permissible. Now, having said that, I want to point out to you that Kant insisted that in our dealings with animals, we treat them kindly, not for their sake, not because we owe it to them, and not because they have rights against us, but we should be kind to animals as practice for being kind to humans. And we should avoid cruelty to animals for the same reason. People who are cruel to animals are more likely to be cruel to human beings, and that would clearly be wrong according to Kant. So Kant would advocate that parents teach their children to be kind to animals and to avoid being cruel to them, so that as they grow and become adults, they will be more likely to be kind to humans and avoid cruelty to humans. So animals have a kind of indirect moral status for Kant. We have indirect duties to animals. We don't have direct duties to them, as I said a moment ago. But because we have direct duties to humans, and humans are interested in animals, we have indirect duties to animals. So, for example, suppose you have a herd of cattle. I may not harm your cattle. It would be wrong of me to harm your cattle, not because the cattle themselves matter morally, but because you do, and those cattle are your property. So I harm you rather than the cattle by harming the cattle. Let me put that again. I wrong you when I harm your cattle. That's a better way to put it. So don't think of Kant as some kind of brute because of his treatment of animals. Yes, he denied them moral status. In his view, they are not ends in themselves, and we have no duties to them, directly to them. But we should be kind to them anyway. The final quotation is also from that page, a little bit below. And here's what Kant says. The practical imperative will thus be the following. And the rest of it, he italicized it. Act so that you use humanity as much in your own person as in the person of every other, always at the same time as end and never merely as means. So that's the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. Not the universal law formulation, that was chapter 7. This one's called the formula of humanity, or the formula of humanity as an end in itself. So for the rest of today, I'm going to focus on the second handout from the Metaphysics of Morals. It was published in 1797. And in case you're wondering, that's 2 years before George Washington died, which may help you locate it in time. Okay, so for the rest of today, we're going to go over this handout that we talked about 2 days ago. And as we go through it, I'm going to read excerpts from this book, The Metaphysics of Morals, to show you in more detail what Kant is saying. So let's get started. I'm going to try to wrap this up today so that we can get a fresh start on chapter 10 on the first lecture next week. Okay, where were we? Get this handout out. You should have it printed. If you still haven't printed it, go do it now. Pause the video, go print it, and We'll go over it together. I want you to follow along. Notice that there are, if you go down near the bottom, you'll look at the number of columns there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 different columns. I could have numbered them 1 through 8, but I was running out of room at the bottom, so I chose not to. Now, go back to the top of the handout. Let's just do a quick review of where we were, where we left off. This is a taxonomy of what I call Kantian duties. And it breaks down duties. It shows you different kinds of duty that each of us has, according to Kant. Duties, he says, now I'm looking at the second row from the top. Duties divide into 2 types. Some duties are duties of virtue, that's Kant's term. Some are duties of right. Now, the best way to think of that is there are moral duties and there are legal duties. And Kant, this book was not about the law. Kant was interested in the law and wrote about law, but this is a book on the metaphysics of morals. So we're not going to say very much about that final column. These are legal duties that we have. The law, according to Kant, should protect us from each other. Therefore, there should be laws against murder, rape, arson, kidnapping, robbery, larceny, assault, battery, and so on. The law protects us from each other. It tells us what we must do and what we must not do. And it punishes us when we break the law, when we violate the rules, when we don't fulfill our legal duties. So that's all I'm going to say about law for Kant, the rest of Kant. Let's talk about now the duties of virtue. The next level down underneath of virtue shows you that Kant believed that there are duties of virtue to the self and to others. So each of us, as strange as this may sound to you, each of us has moral duties to ourselves, as well as moral duties to other people. Now let's focus on duties to self. We'll come back later to duties to other. Look at the next row down below over here under duties to self. We have 2 different types of duties to ourselves, according to Kant. Some of our duties to ourselves are negative. And what I mean by that is these are duties not to do certain things to ourselves, such as kill ourselves, but we'll talk about other things in a moment. We also, in addition to negative duties, have positive duties. These are things that we must do for ourselves. So, according to Kant, each of us has a negative duty not to do certain things to ourselves that are harmful. In addition, we have positive duties to do things for ourselves. Okay, so let's call those negative and positive duties. Let's focus on the negative category now. You'll see what I've written in there. According to Kant, Kant says, don't act contrary to the end of your nature. Kant believed that each of us has a nature, human nature, and there are certain things like self-preservation that are kind of built into us. They're instinctual. They're natural urges and inclinations. Kant also said that we are to preserve and respect our rational capacities. Why? Because remember, for Kant, rational nature is an end in itself. It's the most precious thing in the world. And therefore, since each of us has a rational nature, we have to respect it and protect it. And you'll see under positive duties, we have a duty to promote it. So when you put it all together, each of us has this wonderful, valuable thing. It's rational nature or autonomy. We must protect it and not harm it in any way. We must respect it and we must promote it. We must develop it and make it better. We must perfect it in whatever ways we can. So let's focus on the negative category. We'll come to the positive in a moment. Notice that under the negative category, way over here, down below, Kant made a distinction between our animal nature and our moral nature. Why? Because we said this last time, each of us is an interesting combination of being an animal and being a rational being. We are, according to Kant, rational animals. So being an animal is part of our nature. Right? We have a body. We have bodily needs. And we have to ask, what does Kant say about those bodily needs? Do we need to protect them, respect them, refrain from damaging or destroying them? But we're also moral beings. So let's talk first about this column where it says, as an animal, natural, and moral being. So this would be duties we have to ourselves as an animal being. And what did I write in the column? Let's just go over it and then we'll look at some examples from Kant himself. Kant said that among our negative duties to ourselves as animal beings, we have a duty not to maim, corrupt, or kill ourselves. And by kill, I mean destroy. Okay? You must not maim yourself, you must not corrupt yourself, and you must not kill yourself, which means end your life. Kant also said that we must not defile ourselves by lust. He's talking about sexual desire here, and in a moment I'll read excerpts from Kant and explain what he means by that. And he says, get this, don't stupefy yourself by excessive use of food or drink. Yes, Kant was concerned about how we eat and how we drink, how much, how often, what types, and so on. He wasn't just a busybody trying to tell people what kind of diet to have. Kant believed that excessive use of food or drink can have an effect on our rational capacities. And that would be wrong. We must not do things that undermine or damage or corrupt our rational faculties. Remember, that's the special thing that each of us has, and we must protect it, respect it, and promote it. And certainly not do anything ourselves that damages it. So here's what I want you to do. Turn to pages 5 through 8 of the second handout from the Metaphysics. And I've marked off some passages with the occasional quotations that I want to read to you. Now, look at the heading right up here on page 5. Kant's Metaphysics is a little bit disorganized. He was quite old when it was published, when he wrote it. He was born in 1724. It was published in 1797. So he was 73 years old when it finally got published, which means he worked on it probably early in his 70s. And while he had a few more years to live, he obviously didn't know that. So I think he hurried to get it finished. And if he had had more time or thought that he had more time, he may have gone back over it and organized it a little bit better. So in this particular section, he gave it the title, Perfect Duties to Oneself. All right, Perfect Duties to Oneself. And he has then the subsection called Man's Duty to Himself as an Animal Being. Man's duty to himself as an animal being. And here's what he says. Let's read the first part. The first, though not the principal duty of man to himself as an animal being, is to preserve himself in his animal nature. So, preserve your body. Your body is your animal part. You've got to preserve it. Why? Well, think about it. If the body dies, so does the rational part of us. The rational part of us presupposes a bodily existence. So, if you have a duty to protect your rational nature, that includes a duty to protect the body that it depends on. So we have duties to ourselves as an embodied animal being. We've got to take care of ourselves physically, materially, in order to keep our rational nature functioning and in existence. He goes on to say the following. Now listen carefully. The contrary of this is willful physical death or killing oneself, which can be thought of as either total, meaning suicide, or merely partial, which is mutilating oneself. Mutilating oneself can in turn be either material, depriving oneself of certain integral organic parts, that is, maiming oneself, or formal, depriving oneself permanently or temporarily of one's capacity for the natural and so indirectly for the moral use of one's powers. So notice he's making a couple more distinctions. You can You could either totally destroy yourself through suicide by ending your life, or you can partially destroy yourself through mutilating yourself or maiming yourself in some way. And they're both equally wrong. Kant also distinguishes between two types of mutilation. He calls them material and formal. Material mutilation means taking one of your body parts out, an organ, for example. Formal mutilation means doing something to your body that interferes with or impinges upon the use of your body. Okay? And you mustn't do either of those things. So take care of your body. Don't corrupt it, damage it, destroy it in any way. Don't mutilate your body, and certainly don't kill yourself. Notice Kant has a whole section on killing oneself. If you turn the page, he explains why it's wrong to kill yourself. Let me read a little bit of this to you. He says near the top of page 6, man cannot renounce his personality as long as he is a subject of duty, hence, as long as he lives. And it is a contradiction that he should be authorized to withdraw from all obligation, that is, freely to act as if no authorization were needed for this action. To annihilate the subject of morality in one's own person is to root out the existence of morality itself from the world as far as one can, even though morality is an end in itself. Consequently, disposing of oneself as a mere means to some discretionary end is debasing humanity in one's person, to which man was nevertheless entrusted for preservation. Now, it's not clear who did the entrusting. Perhaps God. Kant is imagining God. God created us, each of us, for a purpose. God gave us an instinct for self-preservation. How long we live, when we die, how we die, that's up to God. And we should not hasten it by ending our own lives. That's to play God. Right? We should instead preserve ourselves for as long as we can, right? Until natural death takes over and takes us. Notice he goes on in the next paragraph to talk about mutilation. He has some interesting points to make here. To deprive oneself of an integral part or organ, to maim oneself, for example, to give away or sell a tooth, to be transplanted into another's mouth, or to have oneself castrated in order to get an easier livelihood as a singer, and so forth, are ways of partially murdering oneself. Now let's stop right there. You may not have known this, but in Kant's day, people who needed money would have a tooth extracted and sell it to someone who could pay for it and wanted it as a tooth of their own. Now, I don't know what the procedure involved, but I assume that the tooth could be removed and implanted somehow in someone else's mouth so that that person could chew. That sounds gross to me and maybe to you, but that's something that happened. Kant says that's wrong. You shouldn't remove functional parts of your body like a tooth and sell them. That is to use your body as if it were a thing rather than an essential part of yourself. Okay, so you can't take a tooth out and sell it. And he mentions being castrated or castrating oneself. Now, suppose that you have a high-pitched voice and it makes you valuable as a singer. Suppose that as you mature, your voice is about to change. I suppose if you castrate yourself, it allows you to keep the high-pitched voice. That must be what Kant has in mind. I don't know quite how it works, but Kant says that would be wrong as well. Again, you're removing a body part, you're castrating yourself, and you're doing it for money, to earn a livelihood. So again, you're using yourself, your body, as if it were a thing, as if it were a mere means to your ends. And those are both wrong. And you can imagine other examples of that. Now listen to what he says about amputation. He says, to have a dead or diseased organ amputated when it endangers one's life, or to have something cut off that is a part but not an organ of the body, for example, one's hair, cannot be counted as a crime against one's own person. Although cutting one's hair in order to sell it is not altogether free from blame. So if you take just part of your body part so that it doesn't interfere with your normal functioning, that is acceptable morally. That does not violate your duty to yourself. So Kant makes a distinction between cutting all of your hair off and maybe just cutting some of it off. And if you cut your hair, the reason why you do it matters. If you're cutting your hair to sell it, he says that's not altogether free from blame, right? That's analogous to taking a tooth out. Hair has a purpose. Maybe you have long hair and don't need all of it to keep your head warm or protected from the sun, but still Kant frowns on that. Right? You should respect your body and take care of your body and not damage or destroy it in any way. Okay? And notice what he says about amputation of a diseased or dead organ. Would Kant be opposed to cutting off one's arm? What if you injure your arm and you develop gangrene? And if your arm is not removed, you will die or are likely to die from gangrene. Kant appears to believe that it would be okay to amputate your arm or your leg or some other body part. The reason, though, is why it's acceptable. You're trying to save your life. So if you damage your body in order to save your life, that's acceptable. If you damage your body in order to make money, that's unacceptable. So the reason why you do these things to your body, for Kant, makes all the difference. Let's turn now to the next section. You'll see the heading here on defiling oneself by lust. Lust is sexual desire, perhaps strong sexual desire. Look at on page 7, look what he says. He's talking about what he calls unnatural sexual activity. Unnatural. Now, he's never really specific about what that involves, but I think we can safely assume that the sex for Kant has one purpose only, and that is procreation. Sex must be between a man and a woman. He elsewhere argues that they must be married to one another. The marriage makes permissible what would otherwise be impermissible. And so he's pretty clearly talking here about sex between two men or two women. And he's talking about what some people call unnatural sex, that we might call sodomy or oral or anal intercourse, because they're non-procreative. There's no chance that they can produce offspring. So when Kant talks about unnatural sex, I think those are the things he has in mind. Any kind of sex that's not procreative or that doesn't have the possibility of producing offspring. So here's what he says about that. He says it's not so easy to produce a rational proof that unnatural and even merely unpurposive use of one's sexual attribute is inadmissible as being a violation of duty to oneself. And indeed, as far as its unnatural use is concerned, a violation in the highest degree. The ground of proof is, indeed, that by it, man surrenders his personality, throwing it away, since he uses himself merely as a means to satisfy an animal impulse. So these animal impulses are sexual drives or desires that we have. And Kant is saying that we must carefully control them and channel them. We must see to it that these natural desires have a proper outlet, that they are used for procreative sex within the confines of a marriage between one man and one woman. And by the way, I neglected to mention, Kant also is talking here pretty clearly about masturbation, which is causing pleasure, sexual pleasure to yourself. Solitary sex, you might say. And Kant is obviously uncomfortable talking about this subject. He says, this does not explain the high degree of violation of the humanity in one's own person by such a vice in its unnaturalness, which seems in terms of its form, meaning the disposition it involves, to exceed even murdering oneself. So as compared to suicide, this is even worse, morally speaking. He says, it consists then in this, that a man who defiantly casts off life as a burden is at least not making a feeble surrender to animal impulse in throwing himself away. Murdering oneself requires courage. But in this disposition, there's still always room for respect for the humanity in one's own person. So he's saying, if you compare this unnatural lust, things like masturbation, to suicide, suicide at least has a certain nobility to it. It exhibits courage. To kill yourself takes a certain amount of bravery or courage. But using your body for sexual pleasure through, for example, masturbation, exhibits no courage whatsoever. He says, unnatural lust, which is complete abandonment of oneself to animal inclination, makes a man not only an object of enjoyment, but still further, a thing that is contrary to nature, that is, a loathsome object, and so deprives him of all respect for himself. So when you put it all together, Kant definitely has a negative attitude toward any form of sexuality or sexual activity that doesn't involve at least the chance of procreation. In all other sex acts, whether we're talking about male-male sex, female-female sex, which we can lump together as same-sex activity, or masturbation, or any kind of sex between a man and a woman that has no chance of procreation, such as oral or anal sex, all of those, Kant says, involve using yourself or another as a source of gratification. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, whether even when a man and a woman are engaged in sex, and therefore allowing the chance of procreation, you have to wonder whether the parties to that act may experience pleasure during the course of it. Doesn't the pleasure that they experience affect the motive in a bad way? What if the motive of a man and woman in having sex is not solely to produce children? But what if part of the motive, or a large part of the motive, is to enjoy the act of sex? One wonders what Kant would think about that. He might say that because your motive is other than doing your duty, procreating to produce offspring, your motive is impure to some degree. It's impure to the degree that pleasure enters into it. So maybe for Kant, the ideal sex act would be one involving a man and a woman who are married to one another. If the sex act, of course, is unprotected, meaning no contraception, no artificial contraception is being used. So the act, it always has the possibility of producing offspring. And ideally, for Kant, it would involve no pleasure on the part of either the man or the woman. And certainly that shouldn't be the dominant motive of the act. So a husband and wife who have sex because they enjoy it or because it bonds them together, Kant would say those are not morally respectable motives. The only morally respectable motive in the sex act between a husband and a wife is that they are trying to produce children. So many people think that Kant's views on sex were backward, that he was kind of what would be the term, old-fashioned. He's, a prude. There you go. He's a prude about sex. Many people might reject that aspect of his moral theory, or try to show that sex done outside of marriage for the purposes of pleasure is not, on Kant's own principles, unacceptable. Okay, the third example of this, we need to move along because we've got a lot of ground to cover. See the heading? On stupefying oneself by excessive use of food or drink. Now let's read a little bit of this. You may wonder, how could drinking or eating have any moral significance whatsoever? For Kant, it's precisely because they can have an effect on our rational capacities. He says on page 7, brutish excess in the use of food and drink is misuse of the means of nourishment, which restricts or exhausts our capacity to use them intelligently. Drunkenness and gluttony are the vices that come under this heading. A man who is drunk is like a mere animal, not to be treated as a human being. Now let's stop right there. Have you ever been around someone who's drunk? Can you reason with such a person? The person may be what's called falling down drunk. And if you try to have a conversation with that person, if you try to persuade the person it's time to go home and go to bed, the person may flail out at you and say, no, I'm just getting started. I need more alcohol. And the person is not acting like a rational being with self-control. The person's acting like an animal or worse. So I think that's what Kant means. Drunkenness, which is excessive use of alcohol that impairs your physical movements and your ability to think clearly, that has moral significance. You are at least temporarily undermining your capacity to think and reason and make decisions. You've thrown away your autonomy, for however long you are drunk. He goes on to say, when stuffed with food, he is in a condition in which he is incapacitated for a time for actions that would require him to use his powers with skill and deliberation. It is obvious that putting oneself in such a state violates the duty to oneself. So even gorging yourself with food to the point where you just want to lie down or sit in an easy chair and digest it, even that has moral significance for Kant. We must stay vigorous and alert at all times. We can't just reduce ourselves to a lump by overeating. Obviously, we have to eat, but we shouldn't overdo it to the point where we become lethargic and lose our initiative, where we want to take a nap. Sometimes if you eat too much, you just want to lie down and take a nap, and rather than go back to work. So you can imagine that Kant would eat 1 or 2 small meals each day and not eat so much that he would want to lie down and take a nap. He would want to get back to work. So he probably prescribed a light lunch. I should point out to you in this connection that Kant was a regular creature. He had habits that he followed every day for his whole life. And some of the habits are amusing. He took a walk every day at exactly the same time, after his dinner, after his lunch. His walks were so punctual that the townspeople of Königsberg, it is said, used to set their watches by them. So you can imagine a housewife washing dishes, looking out her window, saying, Herr Kant should be by any time. And then, yep, there he is. So she was used to seeing him come by at exactly the same time every day on the same path. And he walked the same route every day for year after year, decade after decade. Now, according to a biographer of Kant, he missed his walk one time. One time in his life, he missed his walk. And that was because the mail brought the newest book by someone he admired greatly, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau had written a book, and it just come in the mail, and Kant started reading it, and he couldn't put it down. And that kept him from doing his walk that day. I guess you could say that's the exception that proves the rule. Right? That one exception showed that he had a rule about walking that he never violated other than that one time, apparently. Now, Kant talks about certain substances. We've been talking about drunkenness, which is associated with alcohol use. But notice what he says. He says, the first of these debasements below even the nature of an animal is usually brought about by fermented drinks. He's talking about drunkenness. But it can also result from other narcotics, such as opium and other vegetable products. They are seductive because under their influence, people dream for a while that they're happy and free from care, and even imagine that they're strong. But dejection and weakness follow, and worst of all, they create a need to use the narcotics again, and even to increase the amount. So what's Kant talking about? Addiction. He's saying, be careful. Certain substances, such as opium, can create a need in you. He doesn't use the word addiction, but it's clearly what he's talking about. And once you get addicted to something, it interferes with your daily functioning. And in particular, it interferes with your capacity to reason. So it's harming your rational capacity. It's compromising your autonomy. So you must use food and drink wisely, according to Kant. You have a moral duty to see to it that you don't get drunk and lose control, that you don't overeat, which makes you torpid and languorous and lethargic. You must stay vigorous and active and do your other duties. And you must not, by all means, you must not become addicted to any substance, because that means you're not just temporarily incapacitated, but perhaps permanently, or at least until you can kick the addiction and withdraw from the substance. So Kant thinks that gluttony is a terrible thing. Look what he says at the bottom of page 7. Gluttony is even lower than that animal enjoyment of the senses, referring to drunkenness, since it only lulls the senses into a passive condition, and, unlike drunkenness, does not even arouse imagination to an active play of representations, so it approaches even more closely the enjoyment of cattle. So Kant is saying, as between gluttony and drunkenness, gluttony's worse. At least with drunkenness, and he's not defending drunkenness at all. It's still a violation of your duty to yourself. What he's saying is, if you compare the two, drunkenness is not as bad, because at least when you're drunk, you might have some vivid imagination or imaginations or hallucinations. In other words, drunkenness could be a source of creativity, whereas gluttony, he says, does nothing like that. Gluttony turns you into a cow, right? You're just going to want to sit in your easy chair after you eat, after you pig out. No, that's one word we use for gluttony, pigging out. And it's just going to make you into an animal, a cow or a pig. Okay, so let's go back to this. Those were just some illustrations of what Kant says in connection with this first category over here. Now, I can see clearly that we're not going to have enough time to read other examples, but I will tell you the pages on which Kant discusses each of these things. So I'm going to focus on this for the rest of today, and when I get done with each of the columns, I'm going to give you the page numbers where you can go see exactly what Kant says about it. Let's turn to column number 2. This is a negative duty to ourselves, but it's to ourselves as a moral being. Right? We were just talking about our negative duty to ourselves as an animal being. Now let's focus on our negative duty to ourselves as a moral being, a rational being. Kant says we have duties to ourselves not to lie. Now, obviously, we have duties to others not to lie to them, but he's focusing right now on duties to ourselves. Does it surprise you that we have a duty to ourselves not to lie? When you lie, you damage your own reason, your own intellect. Right? You're harming not only the people to whom you lie, but you're harming yourself. And it may make you more likely to lie in the future. And that may have adverse effects on your reputation, your trustworthiness, and so on, your standing in the community. Now, that's not what makes it wrong to lie, but that's an indirect bad consequence of lying. Kant also says you should not be avaricious. In other words, don't leave your needs unsatisfied. Now, avarice is considered by many people to be a sin. And for Kant, it's a morally wrong thing. You should not be avaricious. What does he mean by that? Well, he clarifies. He says there are different types of avarice. The one he's talking about here is someone who has more than enough to provide for his or her own material needs, but refrains from using them. You are so miserly that you don't use your resources to take care of yourself. And that can have effects on your rational capacities. You've got to eat properly, drink properly, exercise, and so forth. And you've got to spend your money. The point of earning money is to take care of yourself. so that you can do your duty. And if you have more than you need and you're not spending enough to provide for your basic needs, you are minimizing your ability to do your duty. So you've got to stay healthy and strong, both as a body and as a moral being. Don't be avaricious. Now, I'm going to go read a little bit from Kant. He discusses avarice at the very bottom of page 8. You'll see where it says on avarice. Turn the page, and here's what he says. He says, hence, the distinctive mark of the latter vice, and here he's talking about the particular kind of avarice that I mentioned, is the principle of possessing means for all sorts of ends, but with the reservation of being unwilling to use them for oneself, and so depriving oneself of the comforts necessary to enjoy life. And this is directly contrary to duty to oneself with regard to the end. So Kant believes that you accumulate resources and you should use them, right, to make sure that you're healthy and strong. Make sure that you don't deny yourself to the point of being unhappy or weak. You've got to stay strong and vigorous so that you can continue to do your duty, your other duties. Kant says, don't exhibit false humility. Don't be servile. Now, this is fascinating to me and maybe as well to you. Kant is telling you that you should not toady up to anybody. You are nobody's toad. You're nobody's lackey, he says. You have a duty to yourself to hold your head up. You are not the inferior of anyone else. You're the equal of everyone else. You should not belittle yourself or consider yourself inferior to anyone. This, I think, is the kind of thing that made Kant's students weep in the classroom. This is moving. This is inspiring. He's telling them, hold your head up. Don't ever cast your eyes downward in the presence of anyone else. You look that person straight in the eye. You are the equal of everyone, even people you think have a higher social status than you do. You shouldn't kneel before them. In fact, let me read a little bit of what Kant says about this because it's just fascinating. Look at page 10, right here. Listen to the things he's telling people, including his students. Be no man's lackey. Do not let others tread with impunity on your rights. Contract no debt for which you cannot give full security. Do not accept favors you could do without. And do not be a parasite or a flatterer, or, what really differs from these only in degree, a beggar. If you put your position in a beggar, yourself in the position of a beggar, you're beholden to others. You're dependent on others. And that undermines your self-respect, your worthiness as a person. So Kant would say, don't go into debt unless it's unavoidable. Don't borrow money. You should work hard, save your money, and then if rough times are ahead, you have savings to draw upon, and you won't have to resort to borrowing money from others. Borrowing, it creates an inferior position, and you don't want to be in an inferior position. So do not accept favors you could do without. Kant thought that if you allow other people to do favors for you, you are now beholden to them. You have incurred a debt of gratitude to them, and that makes you the inferior of those people. So in order to hold your head high and preserve your self-respect, you should avoid putting yourself in a position where other people want to do favors for you, to help you, okay? Because that's going to create a situation where you are down below them morally. He says, be thrifty then, so that you will not become destitute. Be thrifty, but not so thrifty that you allow your body to become weak, which we just talked about a moment ago. Complaining and whining, even crying out in bodily pain, is unworthy of you, especially if you're aware of having deserved it. Thus, a criminal's death may be ennobled, its disgrace averted, by the resoluteness with which he dies. So, if you're a criminal, if you've been duly convicted of a crime, take your punishment. like a man, as they say, or a woman. Right? Don't whine and cry and carry on and have to be dragged away to jail or to the guillotine. Accept your punishment as the result of your own rational behavior. Take it like a man. That's the expression that you often hear. I'm reminded here of something I once read. When people were being guillotined in revolutionary France in the late 18th century, some people went to the guillotine with a certain nobility. They walked with their head up. They knew their fate, of course. They held their head high. They didn't whine or complain or resist. They did everything that was asked of them, and they went to their deaths with a certain self-respect. I remember reading about one woman who carried on. She didn't want to die. I'm sure none of them wanted to die, but she resisted. She pulled at them as they walked her across to the guillotine. She cried out. She screamed. She yelled out, "I don't want to die. I don't deserve this," and so on. The crowd booed her. The crowd booed her. They had no respect for her because they thought she had lost her self-respect. How dare her not accept her fate and go to the guillotine, go to her death with her head held high without whining and complaining. Now, that's what Kant is saying. If you've been convicted, you should accept the verdict and take your punishment, whatever it may be. Don't whine about it. And by the same token, people who are dealing with convicted criminals should not abuse them or disrespect them in any way. Yes, the person has committed a crime and is being punished for it, but they shouldn't be treated as less than persons by the jailer or the executioner. They're still persons. They still deserve the respect that they deserve as persons, even though they've committed crimes. Kant says, kneeling down or prostrating oneself on the ground, even to show your veneration for heavenly objects, is contrary to the dignity of humanity, as is invoking them in actual images. For you then humble yourself, not before an ideal presented to you by your own reason, but before an idol of your own making. So Kant said you shouldn't pray before idols. Maybe God is a worthy object of prayer and worship, but images of God or idols are not worthy of that. Don't kneel before idols. That's false prayer. Okay, so those are some quotations that support column 2. Let's move on. Let's talk about positive duties to oneself. According to Kant, each of us has duties to adopt certain ends. We have duties to perfect ourselves morally. We have duties to develop or further our rational capacities. And the point of all this is to become worthy of the humanity that dwells within us. We have this wonderful, precious thing, this rational capacity, this thing we're calling autonomy. And you need to become worthy of it by cultivating your capacities. Now, there are two aspects of this. We should cultivate our natural perfections, and we should cultivate our moral perfections. Let's look at category 3, the third column. Natural perfections involve things like understanding and knowledge. So Kant says you should take steps to raise yourself from the crude state of your nature, from animality to humanity. So, yes, you're an animal, but you're not just an animal. So you should take steps to rise above your animal nature and become a full-blown, respectable human who has the capacity to make moral decisions. He says you must cultivate your natural powers, spirit, mind, and body, so that they're fit to realize any ends reason sets for you. Now, if you're wondering what those are all about, look at page 11. Powers of spirit mean things like this. You should study mathematics, logic, and metaphysics of nature, which you may think of as physics. So these are the hard sciences, logic, math, physics. And studying them develops your spirit. Now that's an odd word for that, but those are the things he has in mind. Okay? Cultivate your mathematical abilities, your logical abilities, and your scientific abilities in fields like physics or chemistry, I guess. Powers of mind are those things such as memory, imagination, and the like. So you should do what you can to improve your memory. Cultivate your imagination. One way to do that is to read novels. Today it would involve watching serious drama, movies, right? That allows you to cultivate your imagination. Read history. Take yourself out of your narrow time and place and use your imagination to travel to other worlds. Even hypothetical worlds help you develop your imagination. Finally, powers of the body. I find this interesting because I'm somewhat athletic. Kant says cultivating the powers of the body, gymnastics in the strict sense. He doesn't mean tumbling and balance beam. Gymnastics was a term for moving your body. It's a term from the Greek world. It comes from the word gymnasium, where you went to exercise your body in every conceivable way. He says cultivating the powers of the body is looking after the basic stuff, the matter in man, without which he could not realize his ends. Hence, the continuing and purposive invigoration of the animal in man is an end of man that is a duty to himself. So you've got to keep your body strong and fit and vigorous, and that means exercising it, cultivating the powers of the body, not just the mind. So don't be a couch potato. If you're an intellectual, don't be an egghead. Don't just spend all day, every day reading and writing. You've got to get out. And I've found that in my life, that's been a nice balance. I've been athletic my whole life. I've run 11 marathons and dozens of races at shorter distances. I've ridden my bicycle on a serious basis for 40 years. As soon as this lecture is over, I'm going out to try to beat the rain and get a 20 or more mile ride in. I ride every day, at least 20 miles. Today's the 40th day in a row that I will have ridden. And I enjoy it tremendously. It's good for me. It takes me away from my books and my writing for a while. I'm not sitting. I'm active. I'm vigorous. My heart is pumping. My lungs are inflating. My muscles are being used and toned. It's a wonderful thing. I hope you are speaking to you now, person to person. I hope you are building a certain amount of vigorous exercise into your daily routine. You're young now. Your metabolism will slow eventually, which means that you will put on weight unless you increase the amount you exercise or decrease the amount you eat, or both. Now, maybe you don't mind being heavier. That's a choice every one of us gets to make. But I hope you're exercising for your own good and for the sake of those who depend on you. All right? So, other things in this category 3. Quickly, Kant says, make yourself worthy of your humanity, diminish your ignorance by instruction. So he's saying you have a duty to yourself to acquire knowledge and promote your understanding. And I assume you're doing that. You're in a college. You're a student enrolled at the University of Texas at Arlington. This is one of your courses. You are learning the great traditions of ethics in here. That's a part of cultivating your mind and increasing your knowledge and your understanding of the world. He also says acquire skills. Acquire skills. And these can be practical skills, intellectual skills. Make yourself useful. Right? Acquire as many skills as you can. They will stand you in good stead and your fellow citizens, both. Let's turn to the 4th column. I'm moving a little more quickly. By the way, if you want some examples of natural perfection, the column we just looked at, look at pages 2 through 3 and 10 through 11, and you'll see plenty of examples. I wish I had time to read all of them, but we're running short on time. What does Kant mean by moral perfection? It means develop and increase your ability to act on the basis of duty, or to be motivated by duty. He says, cultivate your will up to the purest virtuous disposition. Be holy. Try to be godlike. Try to, as you do your duty on a day-to-day basis, try to strip away all of the self-interested motivations. right? Don't think in terms of, will this act make me happy or make me more popular or wealthier? You should always focus on duty, right? Understanding what your duty is and doing your duty for the sake of duty. That's what it means to be holy. And we have a duty to be as holy as we can. And that's something that can be improved upon over the course of our lives. He says, make the moral law the incentive to your actions, or the motive. Strive with all your might that the thought of duty for its own sake is the sufficient incentive to every action conforming to duty. Remember, it's not enough to do your duty. You must also do it for the sake of duty. That's a second and separate thing. That's what makes your actions morally worthy as well as right. And finally, he says, seek prosperity. Now, he's not saying get rich for the sake of getting rich. What he's saying is work hard, accumulate resources for this reason. You want to ward off poverty. Because if you fall into a condition of poverty, if you become impoverished, you will be unable to complete and carry out your duties. Remember, that's the main goal of a human being, is do your duty. That's what gives you this inherent dignity and worthiness and respectability. So if you let yourself become poor through laziness or whatever, or bad decision making, you increase the likelihood that you will fail to do your duty. Right? You will be tempted to commit crimes, to put food on the table, and you'll be distracted from your doing of your duty. So the reason not to get poor is not because it will make you unhappy or make you less useful to other people. The reason you shouldn't become poor is because it will interfere with the doing of your duty. You need to be healthy, vigorous, strong, and have enough resources to carry on with your work each day. Okay, if you want some examples of this from Kant, look at page 3 and pages 11 through 12. All right, next. Let's turn to duties to others. Okay, let's move over to the right. Duties to others, as you know, are either negative or positive. Negative duties to others are duties to leave them alone, to refrain from harming them. Remember, it's non-maleficence. Positive duties to others are duties to help them, to assist them. They're duties of beneficence. So let's look at some of the negative duties. Kant says, don't damage, destroy, or interfere with the proper exercise of the rational capacities of any person. Don't treat any person as a mere means to your own ends. Don't express disrespect for the rational capacities of any person. And here he discusses 4 things on pages 16 through 18. Don't be contemptuous of others. That's a form of disrespect. You may be unhappy with what someone has done or said. You may be displeased with it. You may be insulted with it. But don't express contempt for that person in return. Avoid, and I know it's hard to do this when someone has just insulted you, but don't reciprocate. Don't be contemptuous of that person. Let it slide off you, right? That makes you a better person. Don't be arrogant. Don't put yourself up higher than other people. Don't arrogate things to yourself that don't belong to you. You're not special. You may not be below anyone else, but you're not above anyone either. So an arrogant person is someone who belittles other people in the hope that that will somehow elevate them higher. Don't be arrogant. Don't defame people. That means don't engage in libel or slander. Don't express falsehoods about other people in an attempt to degrade or lower their status in the community. Don't try to destroy people's reputations. And finally, don't ridicule people. Don't make fun of people. Now, that happens a lot. I'm sure it's always happened, but that doesn't make it right. Kant says, and let's take a look at what he says on page 18. Kant says on the final page, under ridicule, Kant says, holding up to ridicule a person's real faults or supposed faults, as if they were real, In order to deprive him of the respect he deserves and the propensity to do this, a mania for caustic mockery has something of fiendish joy in it. And this makes it an even more serious violation of one's duty of respect for other men. So refrain from mocking people, making fun of people, ridiculing people. It's hurtful to them. And not only is it hurtful, it's disrespectful to them, and it may cause other people to be disrespectful to them as well. Now, I don't have to give you examples of this. Kant would positively hate Twitter, right? Go to Twitter. Just look around and see what people are saying. It's a minefield of mockery, ridicule, disparagement, belittlement, and so on. It's so disrespectful, Twitter is. Now, I'm not making myself out to be pure. I've engaged in some mockery in my day, and I'm sure you have as well. But again, that doesn't make it right. And if you were a morally good person, according to Kant, you would refrain from it. As hard as that may be, try to treat everyone with respect. Don't make fun of people, which has the tendency to reduce your respect for them and other people's as well. Okay, we're almost done. 2 more columns. Under positive duties to others, Kant makes a distinction between, first of all, what is a positive duty? Look at what I wrote under the word positive. You are to love others. You might say, love others as yourself, which is the biblical injunction from the New Testament. Make others morally permissible ends your own. So you should make other people's ends your own to the extent that you can. But of course, they have to be morally permissible ends. What if my neighbor has an end of becoming a mass murderer, and I know about that? Do I have an obligation morally to adopt that end and make it my own? Of course not, because becoming a mass murderer is a morally impermissible end. But what if my neighbor is engaged in refurbishing furniture? Right? That's a harmless activity, and I can make that end my own. I can bring to my neighbor's attention sales that I've noticed. I may say, I noticed someone selling some furniture over on such and such a road. That would be to help my neighbor. My neighbor may now be able to go over and purchase that old furniture and refurbish it. Maybe I will render assistance. Maybe the neighbor needs help lifting a sofa or a table. I can go over and help. So to whatever extent you can, make other people's ends your own. Be useful. Help other people. Again, they have to be morally permissible ends. Further the permissible ends of others. Failure to do so is not necessarily a vice, but it is a lack of virtue. It reflects poorly on you if you're in a position to help others and you don't. So here are the 2 possibilities. We have positive duties to help others, either their natural happiness or their moral happiness. Now, I can't help other people perfect themselves. I mean, only person X can morally perfect person X. But there are things I can do to assist that. And there's certainly ways I can refrain from interfering with it. So let's focus on this category under natural happiness. Here, Kant says we should promote the happiness of others in need, do good, in other words, be beneficent, sacrifice a part of your welfare to others. If you have more than you need, give some of it to those who have less than they need. Be grateful for kindnesses done to you. You should cultivate sympathetic feeling. In other words, work on your sympathy. We all have a germ of sympathy in us. Some people have a highly developed sympathetic capacity. As Bill Clinton once said, I feel your pain. Many people have that capacity. When you tell your story, tears start rolling down their eye. They're sympathetic to your suffering. They identify with it to some extent. They feel it. And Kant is saying you should cultivate that capacity. That's a good capacity to have because sympathy for others will motivate you to help them. He says, avoid the vices of envy, ingratitude, and malice. And he has a section on each of those. If you want to read more about this category, read pages 3 through 4 and 12 through 16. All right. I want to read one short thing. This really struck me when I read it. I need to take a moment to find it, though. Kant says that in order to cultivate sympathy, you need to go out into the world and move among people who are less well off than you are. I'm reading from page 14. Now listen to this. This is quite moving, I think. He says, while it is not in itself a duty to share the sufferings as well as the joys of others, it is a duty to sympathize actively in their fate. And to this end, it is therefore an indirect duty to cultivate the compassionate natural feelings in us. So we have natural feelings of sympathy. We need to cultivate them and work on them and develop them. Morally, we're required to do that. And to make use of them as so many means to sympathy based on moral principles and the feeling appropriate to them. It is therefore a duty not to avoid the places where the poor, who lack the most basic necessities, are to be found, but rather to seek them out and not to shun sick rooms or debtors' prisons and so forth in order to avoid sharing painful feelings one may not be able to resist. Now I'll stop right there. Kant is saying, don't live a cloistered life. In order to do your duty of developing your sympathetic feelings, you need to go out among people who are disadvantaged, who are suffering various misfortunes. Go to places like hospitals. Just go to a hospital, ask for permission to see some of the patients. Some of the patients may be lonely and might enjoy a conversation to cheer them up, and you can learn about their predicament and their fate and help them. Go to a jail or a prison and visit some of the prisoners if you can. Go to into poor neighborhoods and talk to the people about their plight. Help them if you can. Try to learn about what life is like there. Where else? Prisons, hospitals, impoverished neighborhoods, all of those, sick rooms, hospices, wherever people are suffering or in need, you should go there. And that will help develop your sympathetic feeling. And that in turn will help motivate you to help various people. So that's a good thing. Someone who avoids these places will be shirking his or her duty. Now, you might say to yourself, look, I'm squeamish. I don't want to go to a prison or to an impoverished neighborhood. I'll feel bad. Well, Kant says you've got to break out of that. You've got to put yourself in a position to feel bad. That's how your sympathy is engaged and developed. I've been in jails when I practiced law many years ago. The other attorneys and I, represented criminal defendants, and some of my clients were incarcerated, and so I had to make regular trips to the jail in Tucson, Arizona, to meet with my clients. And I'll never forget what it felt like. Just in order to get inside to meet with my clients, I had to go through a series of doors. And of course, I had an ID card. When I approached a door, I would have to show the card. Someone on a remote camera would read the card and push a button, and the door would open. And I'll never forget the sound of the door opening. It was a huge, thick door made out of metal, and it would unlatch and slowly open. You could hear it opening. And when that door opened, I would walk down the hall. I would come to another door. The same thing would occur, and maybe another door. So I'd have to pass through a series of locked doors just to get in to see my client. And it had an eerie feel to it. It felt like the people in jail were in the belly of a beast, and that I had to go into that beast's belly just to get access to my clients, to represent them. And it was a forbidding place. And it took only one visit there to tell me that's not a place I ever want to end up. And it did give me a feeling of sympathy for people who are incarcerated. Yes, they're there for a reason. Many of them have made bad decisions, and they're paying a price for it. But they never lose their humanity, according to Kant, and they must always be respected as persons who simply made bad choices. And when their punishment is completed, they should be welcomed back into the community with full status, the same status they had before they committed their crimes. So Kant's moral theory can be made use of in criminal justice, right? It insists that all through the criminal justice system, people must be respected as persons. And while some people, through their bad decisions, are being punished, we must never lose sight of the fact that they're not animals, they're not things, they're persons with an inherent worth, value, and dignity. Okay, the final column I can dispose of quickly. If you want to read about it, look at page 4. Kant says that we have a duty to others, a positive duty to others, to do whatever we can to promote their moral happiness or even their moral perfection. I can't make someone else morally perfect, but I can do things that keep from interfering with that attempt. So here's what I wrote. Kant says, promote the moral well-being of others by refraining from doing anything that could tempt them to do something for which their conscience could afterward pain them. So what is he saying? Don't tempt people away from their duty. Don't do anything that distracts people from their duty or tempts them. Certainly don't tempt someone to do other than what their duty requires. So stand back and let people do their own duty to themselves by perfecting their moral character. Now, I know this is a positive duty, not a negative duty. So when I said stand back, that makes it sound negative. But really what Kant is saying is refrain from doing anything that undermines people's ability to perfect themselves. Okay? We're all members of the same moral community. We should all be actively helping each other do their duty. You do your duty, but also help provide the conditions for other people to do their duty. Okay, I went way beyond time. I guess maybe I needed a third day on Kant. I'll think about that in the future. But we've covered everything I need to cover. I will make sure that my questions on the exam are reasonable. They will primarily come from my lectures, but also from Feldman's book. Right? Don't be surprised if I take a question directly from Feldman. The handout that I've been going over, I won't take questions directly from it. It's primarily intended to illustrate things. This I will test you on. Make sure you understand all of the distinctions and categories, if not the examples that we've been discussing. Okay, I got to shut this down and go ride my bike. Got to take care of the body, the animal. Okay, have a great day and a great weekend. I'll see you on the screen probably on Tuesday, perhaps Monday, but there'll be 2 lectures next week.